In this video, I'll be talking about hearing. And so when we hear, this is when audition occurs, in the sense of audition. And when we start to hear, audition begins in the pinna, and this is the external or visible part of the ear, which is shaped like a funnel in order to draw sound waves inside of the ear and guides them to the auditory canal. And then at the end of the canal, the sound waves strike a tightly stretched, highly sensitive membrane right here, which is known as the tympanic membrane or the eardrum. And this vibrates with the waves. And then the vibrations travel in these small bones here, which is inside the middle of the ear. And these bones are known as the ossicles. And we have the hammer, or the malleus, the incus, or the anvil, and then the stirrup, or the stapes. And these three bones connect that lead to the cochlea, which is that snail structure you see there. This is a snail-shaped, liquid-filled tube in the inner part of our ear. And then the vibrations cause the oval window, the membrane covering the opening of the cochlea, to vibrate, and then disturbing the fluid within the cochlea. And then the movements of the fluid inside of the cochlea bend the hair cells within the inner ear. And this is much of the same way as like a gust of wind blowing weeds or stalks in a field. And then the movements of the hair cells trigger nerve impulses in the attached neurons here, these auditory neurons. And these auditory nerves then send auditory information and sound to the auditory cortex in the brain. And so that's the process of how we hear, and that's the process of how sound travels from the pinna, going through the auditory canal, to the eardrum, and then the sound waves vibrate throughout these three bones into the cochlea, which has hair cells, which transducts the sound waves into electrical signals, which then brings it to the auditory nerve to send to the brain. Then moving on, these sound waves either have long wavelengths or shorter wavelengths. And longer sound waves have lower frequencies and a lower pitch, whereas shorter sound waves have higher frequencies and higher pitches. And so a lower pitch would be a really low sounding sound, whereas a higher pitch would be really high pitched sound. And then the amplitude, as we covered before, determines how much energy the sound wave contains. And we perceive the amplitude as the amount of loudness. So the lower the amplitude, the quieter the sound will be, whereas the higher the amplitude, the louder the sound will be. And then further, according to place theory, different portions of the basilar membrane inside of the cochlea are sensitive to the sounds of different frequencies. So here we have an uncoiled cochlea, and higher frequencies occur at the base here, whereas lower frequencies occur at the tip of the cochlea here. And the base of this membrane responds best to high frequencies. So high frequencies respond best in this area, whereas the tip of the membrane responds best to lower frequencies. And hair cells that are in the base portion are used for higher pitched receptors, whereas hair cells in the tip of the cochlea are used for lower pitched receptors. And once the hair cells pick up these different high-pitched or low-pitched receptors, it sends that information through the auditory nerve to the auditory cortex within the brain. There's also the temporal theory, in which the frequency of sound is coded by the activity level of a sensory neuron from a hair cell. And so these hair cells fire action potentials, which are related to the frequency of the sound wave. And the action potential will send information to the auditory nerve and then to the auditory cortex in order to perceive the frequency of a sound wave. Then in the next video, we'll be talking about taste and the rest of our sensations